3, 2, 1.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special edition of 3Y. I'm Rick. I'm joined tonight by Anthony, and Peter is back with us after a brief absence last evening. We're all kind of still recovering a bit from the afterglow of Talladega, but tonight is a very special edition of 3Y as we commemorate the birthday, or what would have been the 68th birthday of Dale Earnhardt Sr. And there isn't much that hasn't been said about the man, but we're going to take tonight a little bit of a different approach to honoring the memory of Dale Sr. We're going to talk a little bit about where each of us was on the day that we lost him, what we were doing, kind of, catching our breath after all those years. And then we'll talk about what he meant to each of us. And we do invite the viewers, the folks listening in, to participate tonight. If you've got a comment that you'd like to make about, what Dale Sr. meant to you, where you might have been on the day of February 18th, 2001, we'd be delighted to hear from you. I'm going to, in a moment, turn it over to Anthony briefly so that he can tell you how to do that. When we talking a bit about where what he to each of us, we're going to play a little game called What If, and we've got some really interesting seed topics regarding NASCAR, the vehicles, the tracks, the playoff structure. Exactly everything that you can imagine about the sport we love, and how, if he had survived, if he had lived, how that sport might look different than it does today. So, Anthony, if you can help us by explaining to the viewers how they can participate in this, what we hope to be a very interactive session to talk about the life and legacy of Dale Earnhardt Sr.
All right. First off, we want to send a big thanks to all the viewers that joined us yesterday and today. Made yesterday's broadcast our most popular and shared broadcast to date in our young age. So thank you for that, and to continue doing that, if you come across our channel, hit the subscribe button, hit that bell notification. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a live chat window where we'll get immediate questions and comments from you guys. Any participation, as long as it's constructive and somewhat on topic, is greatly encouraged, and we look forward to continuing this relationship with you guys.
So, with that, I guess I'll lead off, and I know I had mentioned this in our opening show to our viewers. The day of February 18th, 2001 had a very interesting significance for me, because we were celebrating the second birthday of our son Ben, who ultimately went on to race go-karts and race cars. We had a birthday party for him here at the house, and I think we had probably 20 people or so here, and we had the race on in the background. We didn't kind of make it a big focal point for the party because we had family and friends, and everybody was kind of interacting with each other. And so my parents, who at the time were elderly, lived probably 10 or 15 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. My dad had stopped driving because of his age. So, I would pick them up and bring them home and whatnot. So the party was ending. My wife was in the kitchen cleaning things up, and I was taking my folks home. When I came back home, this was probably 6:30 or so that evening, I asked my wife where Ben was. She said, well, he's in the living room. He's in front of the TV. He hasn't moved since you left. I said, oh, what's he watching? She says, well, I don't know how to tell you this, but something terrible happened at the end of the race today. And I said, well, what's that? She said, well, some guy, Earnhardt, died at the end of the race. I said, the kid? And she says, well, not unless the kid is like 50 years old. Well, I have to tell you, my heart just totally sunk. And I go into the living room, and there's my 2-year-old kid sitting there, can't take his eyes off the television set. And that was how I discovered that Dale had passed. And that was really the start of how our son got involved in racing. And you guys know him pretty well. He's all in when it comes to anything regarding racing. So that was my side of the story. Anthony, Peter, I'm sure you've got something to share as well, because you guys would have been really young when it happened.
Yeah, not quite as young as Ben, but I believe I was just about 13 when that event happened. I remember um the lead up to the 500. I remember watching the pre-race ceremonies like I always do. Um, the I'll never forget the segment of Senior and Terry Bradshaw driving the pace car around at night, and at the very end, you got Dale standing up on the car, kind of reenacting his 500 victory celebration. Um, the start of the race, it was Dodge's first race back in the sport in quite a few years. Um, it was one of those races where, unfortunately, I didn't get to watch the whole thing from start to finish. Me and my family did go out for a few hours towards the end of the race. I think we wound up going out somewhere probably with like halfway through the race, I would say. I remember a good portion of the race. Um, Went out, and ironically enough, in one of the local shopping centers by us, there was a small little like sports memorabilia store, and they had small little collections of the 164 diecast cars that were just above like Hot Wheels or Walmart quality, so they were considered adult collectibles. And they had Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s AC Delco #3 car. So as I was buying that is right around the time when that turn 4 tragedy occurred. I had no idea. We didn't have good radio coverage on for the ride home. There was no reports. We didn't have uh, radio stations that reported NASCAR in the sports segments of their shows. So we get home, and it's probably not until about 9:30 at night, about an hour or two after we get home, when we turn on um, NBC News, and I forget the gentleman's name, but he's one of the anchors that was really good friends with Dale, and
That
his
would be
son
Brian
was,
Williams.
yes, Brian Williams. And he comes on the air, and all of a sudden you see, well, my father sees the picture of Dale Earnhardt's face, so he knew I was in watching the race earlier that day. So he calls me over and he says, "Hey, they're going to talk about the race," and you see underneath Dale's picture the years 1951 to 2001. And before he even had to say anything, my heart sunk, and I just started to cry. And my dad just continues watching the broadcast with me. I'm watching the broadcast. My mother's in the other room. I couldn't finish watching it once I heard and I saw the first replay. I just went into my room. I couldn't deal with it. He was like a god among men to me. My mother comes into the room asking me what's wrong, what happened, and I tell her that in the last lap, the last turn with a few hundred feet to go, Dale Earnhardt was killed in the Daytona 500, and it was just one of those things that you couldn't imagine happening to anybody, let alone the man in black, who for all the wrecks that you had seen him go through over the years and in his career, you would just think that this man was invincible and indestructible. And then to hear that he was taken so suddenly and in such a tragic fashion, um, in a weird way, it lit 10 more fires under my butt, and as far as my passion for the sport. But there was a big fire that also flamed out that day, and we're going to see in the rest of this broadcast with the three of us talking exactly what kind of an impact that day had. But we're going to also celebrate this man's life, like you said.
And then for me, it was a little bit different. I guess as a young, almost 11-year-old kid, I was considering myself a veteran of the sport at that age, not really understanding too much though. And what really got me was I had never seen death in the sport at that point. What really got me was he was the guy that I saw as the one of the major rivals of my favorite driver, and somebody that I didn't root for every Sunday, but if he won, I was happy because I love Chevy as well. But really, when that happened, the sport changed for me. I always knew there was an added danger to it. It was kind of part of all of that got exciting. But what really got to me was I didn't know the magnitude of somebody could lose their life in this sport, and a major figure bowing out at that time. That was to this day it still gives me chills, and it's just something that I just go right back to. I watched the race as a young kid. I saw the crash, and then after the crash, I didn't stick around and watch the post race. I never really did, unless it was like a favorite driver win. But then I remember it's very similar to Anthony, seeing the newscast. I didn't see him the same night, but I saw them the next day, and they're talking. They're showing Mike Helton and that name, the infamous line at this point where it says, "We lost Dale Earnhardt." And that was where it hit me really hard. My parents not very involved in NASCAR or fans of the sport. Saw in newspapers there was clippings and articles that they saved to give to me, and it had just gone on your February or winter break or midwinter recess, we used to call it. And I just remember, not turning on my PlayStation NASCAR games, just being very shaken up at what happened. And then coming back to school, even my principal and fellow teachers realized, they're like, he's not the same. Something happened, and he's not bringing his NASCARs around anymore. Something's amiss. And that's when they figured out, oh my gosh, that driver that we heard on the news, maybe he liked that driver. Maybe it's really gotten to him. And I remember sitting with my principal and just saying, like, I didn't think somebody could die racing. I love racing, and I always want to love racing, but I'm scared if racing can take away people that I really like. And that moment really kind of hit home to me.
Three really interesting and totally different stories. And, I know that we have some viewers who are probably new to the sport, some viewers who don't understand anything about the sport or the history. And if you can imagine, if you can, in baseball, if Babe Ruth were lost at the height of his popularity, imagine if Michael Jordan, as a basketball star, was lost at the height of his popularity. I'll bring it to even more current days, and God forbid, if we ever lost, whether you like him or not, you cannot deny talent, and that's true. That's true of Senior as well. There were many people who didn't care for him as a driver, but imagine if we lost Tom Brady. This guy has won so much and given so much to the sport. Imagine if we lost guys like Babe Ruth or Michael Jordan or Tom Brady. That's the magnitude that we're talking about. We are talking about someone who really revolutionized the sport, and all of a sudden he's not there. And keeping with that part of the topic, what did he mean to each of us? And Anthony, I'm going to go to you first.
I guess it's got to go back to the earliest memories, and this is probably what made some of them fans of his, and a lot of them why they didn't like him. But my first memories were watching races in the early '90s, and just from, I guess, watching cartoons and watching other like movies. The guy that was in black was always the big honcho and the one that everybody hated, but he was also like the big, anti-hero. And I was just naturally just drawn to the car. I didn't know Earnhardt. I wasn't old enough to know Earnhardt in the Wrangler days. But to see that black number 3 race car going around, I didn't know who he was. I knew what his car was. And then eventually you start to watch a little bit more and you start to realize, oh, that's driven by this guy called Dale Earnhardt. And I was like, oh, that's like a really cool name. Like when I was a kid, I thought it was the coolest name ever, Dale Earnhardt. And then as I get more and more into the sport, you do more and more research, you follow your favorite driver more and more. And towards the middle of the 90s, you get that the rivalry between him and the newcomer Jeff Gordon, who I also admittedly was a little bit of a fan of in the 90s, just because I thought the rainbow car was really cool. I went a lot off of paint schemes back then. But also I love the fact that there was that rivalry of mutual respect. And then you start to hear, when I was following, I thought Dale was like the best driver ever. I thought he won every single race under the sun before I started following him. So to hear that he had never won a 500 to me was absolutely shocking. I couldn't believe that he had been in the sport for so long and never won the biggest race of them all. So to watch the 98 500 and to see him win was like watching David conquer Goliath, but at the same time, you had the feeling that Dale was the Goliath of the sport, but Daytona was Dale's Goliath. And he had that famous phrase up in the media center that he finally got that dang monkey off of his back. And you could see that it changed him that season and moving forward. He was just a regular guy that I just grew. He grew on me. He kept winning. I liked that. I didn't want to, I was young. I was going to root for a winner, and it just so happened that the black number 3 is what drew me in. And then you start hearing that he's got a son coming up, and there was the natural progression to following Junior in the Busch series. But what he meant to me was to everybody, he was the intimidator on the track. He was the one that everybody was scared of. But when you read articles about him outside of the car, he's who everybody went to for advice, for friendship, for leadership. He was everything that you're taught about in school. Look for the good role model, look for the leader, imitate the best that you can be. And in the sport of NASCAR, to me, Dale Earnhardt was that person.
Wow, that is really a terrific testimonial to Dale Earnhardt. And I'm so glad we're doing this segment, because he did mean something different to each of us. Peter, your perspective is a little bit different than Anthony's, and I've always been interested in what you thought of the Man in Black, because after all, your favorite was the guy in the rainbow car.
Well, yeah, for sure. But you know what? If I had to narrow it down to one word, just to start, I would say respect. And that may be a shocking word from someone who followed Gordon and saw like the heated rivalry, but especially looking back now, somebody who's in my mid to late 20s, and just appreciating that time that I got to watch. And I think back to that Unrivaled documentary that came out not too long ago, right around the start of the season. He was different for me. Like Anthony said, he was the Man in Black. He was that head honcho. He was the boss. He was the big guy. And to be the best, you had to beat the best. And I was infatuated with this up-and-comer and this bright car. Looked nothing like any of the other drivers. He was much younger, so I related to that in Jeff Gordon. But in order for Gordon to succeed, he had to beat Dale Earnhardt. There were other drivers too that were veterans, grizzled and seasoned in the sport, but it was Dale Earnhardt's sport. He was the king of the playground. You had to best him at his own game. You had to knock him off the high point of the castle, and it was not easy to do because he made your job the toughest thing to do. And I used to get fits if I saw the black number 3 car pushing the Rainbow 24 around when I was a little kid, trying to understand the sport. He reminded me of like some of the villains from the Speed Racer cartoon I always reference with you guys. Again, the car just looked menacing. Outside of that, though, when I've mentioned in the first cast that I was fortunate enough to join you guys, that first race that I watched, my introduction to NASCAR, and don't remember it so much because I was so young. But the car that stood out to me when I was searching for my favorite cartoon was that black number 3 car. I was watching on that black and white television, and that car stood out more than anything else. And even as somebody very, very young, I understood the importance of him. And then as I became a fan of Jeff, I still understood the importance of Dale. You had to understand that he was the sport. And if my guy was going to be a big part of the sport just like him, he had to become this driver, and he had to, stand toe to toe with him. And I used to love that, because when you saw them outside the race car, what I really saw, and that's why I go back to that one word that I pointed out, I saw respect. I saw that Dale respected Jeff. He gave him what he had to. He played up to the camera. He, teased Jeff Gordon as an older brother would to a younger brother, or a father to a son. And I love that whole dynamic. I thought Dale Earnhardt was so cool, and I thought it was so great when they had these epic battles. If Jeff got spun out or taken out, yeah, I was definitely a little heated at that. But I respected him so much. And one of the things I always think back to, and I tell my fiance this all the time, who's an extreme NASCAR fan now, probably knows a little bit more than me these days. I always think back to, I close my eyes and remember what the 90s was like. And it almost reminds me of the intro to Monday Night Football, where the country music was playing and you see all the neon lights. But for me, I close my eyes and think of the 90s and NASCAR, and I see those mirror sunglasses, that black number 3, the handsome mustache that he had. And I just remember the arms crossed and just that tough, badass image of that man. And he was NASCAR to me. He still is NASCAR to a lot of people. And I really think that he is a true icon and image to the sport. And that's why I go back to that word respect. I have nothing but respect for Dale Earnhardt Sr., and I miss him every day.
Another great tribute to Dale. For me, you hear this all the time when people talk about his legacy. He was one of us. And what does that mean? You hear that term a lot. He's one of us. Well, to understand what that really means, you have to understand where he was from. I know that the two of you have been there. Kannapolis, North Carolina is an old mill town, Cannon manufacturing. And I know that I guarantee you've had a Cannon product in your house. They make textiles, they make towels, things like that. Almost everybody who ever lived in Kannapolis worked in the mills. It was a blue-collar town. Not too many people got out of that town. Not too many people got out of that town to go to college. If they were really lucky, they went to high school and graduated from high school. And when they graduated, there was a job for them in the mills. The town I grew up in was very similar to that. It wasn't a mill town, but it was a manufacturing town of about 25,000 people. You could probably count, 100 people out of a town of 25,000 who were white-collar workers. Everyone worked the factories. They worked, places like Stanley Tool. Everybody knows what Stanley Tools are. Their headquarters is in the town next to where I grew up. So you either worked for Stanley Tools, or you worked for a little tool and die shop, or a sheet metal fabricator, or, folks like that. So, the connection with Dale Earnhardt Sr. for someone like me, whose dad worked in the factories, was very, very deep. And we kind of understood, the hard work ethic and long days and, the play time that you had. It was kind of, you hear that term, work hard, play hard. That is exactly what we saw in Dale Sr. So folks, from towns like where I grew up, indeed, he was one of us. There was no question about it. A lot of the things that both of you said resonated with my generation as well. I said to Anthony earlier today, we were talking about clothing, and I said, for me, it's a black Hanes t-shirt, one of these, and a pair of Wranglers. And that's the culture that I'm from. And even at 60 years old, it's the culture that I still embrace. And I owe a good part of that to he wasn't really a childhood hero, because he really is a contemporary of mine. But having watched Dale's entire career, he was the guy. And with no disrespect to the Rainbow Warriors, You know, my age group kind of viewed Jeff Gordon as being an interloper. And it wasn't until Jeff started to really become the heir apparent as the leader in the sport that people like me developed a tremendous respect for Jeff, his talent, and actually not just his talent on the track, but his talents off the track as a businessman. And interestingly enough, as a businessman, these two polar opposites found a way to do business together. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. I think Peter's going to help us with that, isn't he?
I believe.
Yep. Sorry, I had to unmute the microphone there. I apologize. But one of the things we want to really look forward to with the business perspective of it was Action Performance. Action Performance was a brand that Dale Sr. started, where he saw that there was an opportunity to monopolize and drive essentially a merchandising juggernaut through NASCAR. There was a really good opportunity to make a lot of money because there wasn't so much merchandise in the past. And that's something I remember that many of the announcers and personnel of NASCAR talked about, you know, with this uprise of the retro and throwback gear resurfacing in more recent times since the Darlington throwback has been re-implemented and established. They said, oh, you know, if you look back to the Petty and Pearson days, you know, there really wasn't much merchandise until really STP stepped up. There wasn't much merchandise. Well, Dale Earnhardt Sr. kind of led the charge with merchandising and really, really changed the outlook and the perspective of NASCAR, because now you gave fans an opportunity and an image to showcase who was your driver. And he was able to recruit Jeff Gordon in the 90s to start because he saw the uprise in popularity with Jeff and the uptick in performance from Jeff and Hendrick Motorsports. And as the two of them took off, they made millions of dollars. I believe Anthony gave me the stat before. In 1997 alone, they made $182 million just off merchandising alone. And shortly after that, they started to bring other drivers into the mix as well. I can talk about the Roush drivers of Mark Martin and Jeff Burton, the Gibbs drivers of Bobby Labonte, Tony Stewart later on, into the 2000s. But that Action Performance brand was something that truly revolutionized NASCAR to the way we see it today, where you cannot go to a NASCAR race without seeing somebody with a car or a driver's face or number stapled onto their t-shirt.
It's interesting that you mentioned revolutionary, and that's, for a guy who was clearly, old school. Like, I can remember the very, very famous video of him kind of standing, outside the car as the car is rolling down the track and kind of adjusting things on the windshield. That's a guy who, a mechanic. He was his own mechanic. But he was revolutionary in a lot of different ways, which we're going to explore a little later in the show. And one area that was particularly touching, given the time in history that Dale interceded in a fellow driver's behalf. So there's an awful lot to talk about. I know this has been done before, but we're going to take kind of a different look at what the world would have been like if the events of February 18th, 2001 had not occurred. And we've got several items to discuss that really would pique the curiosity of even the most casual race fan. For starters, his career. Now, there was a resurgence in his career. He had some down years and was starting to put things back together. His 1990 season was actually pretty good. I'm sorry, his 2000 season. I beg your pardon. And he was 49 years old. how many more years do you think he would have sat in the seat had he not gotten into the wreck at Daytona?
I think the plan was 2003 and out. There's an interview that Dale Jr. did with Dan Patrick, I believe, on what I called his like comeback tour of 2017, and also with Graham Bessinger and Joe Rogan, where he alluded, and Richard Childress also gave some interviews very recently, saying that him and Dale had pretty much already talked about it. And Dale in one of the interviews I was able to find was open about it at some point in 1999, I believe, when he signed a contract for what would have become his last deal with RCR. And the plan was in 2003, Dale hinted strongly that that was probably going to be it for him. And they were going to bring up a driver that actually did wind up replacing him, Kevin Harvick. Whether or not he was going to be the one in the 3 car afterwards is something that we're going to talk about later on. But it looks like right now the plan or the speculation from Junior and from Richard Childress was that Dale had already talked to them and pretty much indicated that he had won everything he had to win. He won 7 championships. I don't think he wanted 8. He's a race car driver. He's going to want that next championship, but I don't think that was going to define him. He let every Sunday define him, not all the statistics. So I think 2003 was probably going to be his last year driving. And where we go from that is for future segments of this broadcast.
Peter, thoughts?
Yeah, I have to say, I have to agree with Anthony. I remember reading, several different outlets, and 2003 seemed to be where it could have ended had that tragic day not have happened. And it seemed like RCR was to the point where they were almost ready with Kevin Harvick. They felt that Kevin Harvick was the guy. That he was the driver handpicked by Dale Earnhardt Sr. And there was rumors that Harvick was going to come up, I believe, later in the 01 season, if I'm not mistaken. He was going to drive the number 30 American Online car, and that was going to kind of begin the transition as to either bringing him in to replace Dale Sr. when Dale Sr. decided that he had enough, or if he was going to become the second driver to Dale Sr. and then eventually become the prime driver. So maybe he would have taken a 31, or maybe he could have established himself in the 30 for some time until Dale Sr. decided to retire. And then they could have possibly ran the 30 and 31. There's all different speculation there, but I do believe that 2003 was the end. And I believe Anthony may have something. We've talked about this in a great deal. So I'd like to see if we've got something to add with this 30 car here.
Yeah, no, I do sometimes forget just because of the speed in which Harvick came up through his career. It was talked about earlier, prior to the 2001 season, I believe, that Kevin Harvick was going to run a few races in 2001 in the number 30 AOL car that eventually, I believe it was Jeff Green got put into. And as far as the plan, it was in 2002 and 2003, Kevin Harvick was going to run full time as Dale Sr.'s teammate for 2 years. I guess to nurture him and pedigree and mature him as a race car driver alongside one of the greats. But again, I think it still stands that in 2003, Senior was going to exit the driver's seat and take on a new role, whatever that would have been. But yeah, I did forget that point. AOL was slated for a few races with Harvick towards the second half of the year. And it was already at that point announced before Senior's death that in 2002 and 2003, the two of them were going to be teammates in some capacity. I just don't know if it was going to become a 3-car operation or if they were going to drop the 31 car altogether that Mike Skinner had the seat in.
And that remains to be the great question of the status of RCR at that time, is the great unknown there, where who would have been in which ride, how that whole team would have panned out. And that's something that's really interesting. I love the speculation on it because even in this day and age in 2019, I love talking about silly season. And it can never come too soon for me. You always want to kind of see that kind of shake up and change things. Some drivers need a fresh start sometimes. So that kind of is reminiscent of that. The other thing I want to bring up, and this will kind of maybe lead us into our next subtopic here, is if he would have retired in 2003, do you think that he takes more of a leadership and ownership role in grooming the next generation of RPR, or does he go into a full management position with Dale Earnhardt Incorporated and he starts to lead the charge over there? What do you guys think about that one?
I think if you look at where he was in 2001 or leading into 2001, like Rick had mentioned, people kind of gave him a little bit of slack where it seemed like he was starting to focus more towards the merchandise. A lot of interviews, and especially one that aired today on Sirius XM with Chocolate Myers, who was Earnhardt's gas man for quite a few years, was that when Richard first went to Dale and said, "Hey, we're going to take on Mike Skinner, put him in the 31 car, and you're going to have a teammate," Dale hated that. Dale basically flat out told Richard, "I ain't going to work with them. You do what you want with that team over there. But as far as I'm concerned, I got my team. He's their team. I ain't going to work with them." And Chocolate recalled a few times, I guess at restrictor plate races, where Richard would get on the radio and tell Dale, "Hey, see if you could give Skinner a tow. Bring the two of you up to the front of the pack." Dale would listen for maybe half a lap, and then he would see a hole that only he could fit in, and it was the Dale show again. But to see that happen towards the end of the 90s, and to see that Dale had essentially picked Harvick to fill the seat for that AOL car, I think is a very big indicator that he was preparing for the end of his career. He was ready to pass the torch along in whatever capacity that was.
It's interesting. I have no doubt that probably 2003 was going to be it. There were clear trends that Dale was becoming more involved with the business of the business. And I think whether it's merchandising, I really think what happened with Dale, and it's unfortunate, obviously, that his life was cut short, and we'll never know at this point. I think the brand of Dale Earnhardt actually caught up with him. That his immense marketability, even though he did tap into it, it happened so rapidly and with such great expansion that someone had to actually manage the brand, and that racing ultimately was going to take a backseat to that. We're going to talk, and I'm going to try to maybe merge a couple of our topics together because both of you channeled into it a bit. Obviously, Dale drove for RCR. Dale also, at the end of his life, was a race team owner. What becomes of RCR and what becomes of DEI if Dale is still with us? And I'll let you take that one first, Anthony.
Okay. It's no suspicion that, or it's no secret that Richard really did a lot for Dale. Richard took himself out of a seat to put Dale in it. And he got 6 championships by having that relationship with Richard. They shared the better part of, I think, 17 seasons together, had quite a few victories. I don't think that Dale creates Dale Earnhardt Incorporated without the intent of that being his retirement plan. I also don't think he leaves Richard high and dry, which is why I think you see those inklings and hints of Dale willing to be a teammate to somebody, and in particular Kevin Harvick, for 1 or 2 seasons, make sure that, I guess, that was his way of telling Richard, look, I'm not just leaving you. Get a driver in the team that can be the future. And I don't think Dale would have picked anybody but Kevin Harvick if he didn't think that Harvick would have been able to provide the future for RCR that Harvick eventually did, and give RCR that longevity of having another driver for, I believe, 12 seasons, the better part of 12 seasons, and a lot of shared success with that. I do think Dale goes into a complete ownership and leadership role of DEI. There's a reason why he built DEI straight up the road from where he lived. If you look at a Google Maps image of DEI, which I'll pull up here while Peter talks, if you look at where DEI is situated, it's on a very long stretch of straight road, and just south of it, there's a little turnoff. And if you follow that little turnoff, you go right to Dale's estate, his property, where he lived. There's one way in, there's one way out, and as soon as you come out, you turn right, and there's Dale Earnhardt Incorporated. There's a reason why he built it so close to home. That was his retirement plan. He was going to take DEI to the next level, I think, but at the same time, he wasn't going to leave Richard behind. I wouldn't have been surprised if there was some type of alliance between the two teams. And that's more speculation for later on. But that I don't think he would have left DEI high and dry and kind of tried to balance between the two. His intent for DEI was his retirement plan. He was setting up for the future after racing with that company.
I'd certainly agree with both of those points that you guys had made, especially with what Anthony was saying. I think that was an outstanding take with how he felt that he wouldn't have just walked away from RCR. He had to make sure that for everything that Richard has done for him, he would make sure that RCR was in a sense of a point where it could be a seamless transition into a new driver that he had handpicked, groomed to continue the success of the sport. And I certainly think that he would have tried to have kept a very close relationship with RCR, especially because most of his success, what we all truly remember him racing for, was Richard Childress Racing. With that being said, Anthony brought up another excellent point with the location of DEI to where Dale Earnhardt Sr. lived. Needless to say, that whole merchandising and business aspect that Rick had mentioned before, I really think that takes the forefront. I have to be in agreement there. I think that he saw where he was going with the sport, that the business aspect was something that was taking much more of his time, concern, and responsibilities. And he was beginning to kind of, I guess, almost transition into that ownership role more so than the driver in the later stages of his career. I truly think that he would have been much more involved with Dale Earnhardt Inc. and would have tried to keep somewhat of a relationship or maybe an alliance like we see today with many of the teams with RCR. And I believe if he would have survived and that would have been one of the realities that we would have seen, I truly think that that would have been a dominant alliance in NASCAR, especially the way that the teams are sharing information today. Like we saw Hendrick and Stuart Haas for many years, like we saw Furniture Row and Joe Gibbs. I think that they would have really hit on something there, especially with the crop of drivers that went through both of those teams in that time frame.
Anthony, I think you're ready with a graphic that you had told us you were going to show us. Is that ready? There we are. So there's Dale Earnhardt Incorporated. And then the estate is right there where he's circling.
Hi, sorry, I did not realize that my microphone was muted. All right, so here's Dale Earnhardt Incorporated. As you guys can see here, if you head south on Route 3, which was actually renamed Route 3 after his passing, This is where Junior used to live when he raced for DEI. If you make the left hand out of this road and follow this road up, that was Dale's estate when he was alive. So he was really, really close to where his future was. He built within a mile of Dale Earnhardt Incorporated. And now this is something that we found out while we were down in Kannapolis, was that if you continue up this road, this is, I'm assuming they're undergoing major construction. If you continue up this windy road here, this is all part of Earnhardt's property and estate. If you take this road up here and come to this small little lot, this right here is Earnhardt's burial site.
You know, he certainly, for a guy who, and we talked about his blue collar roots and his, you know, basically from a background that, you know, wasn't a fancy college education. This was a really, really, really brilliant businessman. You know, if you think about it, the brand is still iconic years and years and years after his passing. I'm going to throw a question out there. Talk EI and RCR and a possible alliance. What happens with two things? Does Chevrolet ever see any kind of downtick like we have seen up until yesterday? And what happens with Hendrick Motorsports? Are they the juggernaut that they became?
I'm gonna let Peter take that one first. I want to see the original Hendrick point of view before anybody else.
Okay, fair point. So what I would say is I think Hendrick Motorsports is still going to be the juggernaut that they existed as, and they still are. Just because even before the Gordon era, you can see that Hendrick Motorsports in the 80s was really on the rise. Once they got that first win with Bodine, they really started to take off. And really one guy that doesn't get as much notoriety or credit that truly deserves putting Hendrick Motorsports on the map is Tim Richmond. And Tim Richmond, Dale Earnhardt Sr. truly believed if Tim Richmond survived, he could have been a NASCAR champion. He was a great. Hendrick had the performance. Chevrolet had the backing. Rick was one of the most successful Chevrolet dealerships in the country. They were making hand over fist with any dealership that had Rick Hendrick's name on it. And he was dumping an insane amount of resources into NASCAR. He believed in the sport. He wanted to survive in the sport. And then the pairing of acquiring a hot shot by the name of Jeff Gordon in the early 90s, paired with a crew chief like Ray Evernham, and they really took off. I think it could have been different had that DEI RCR alliance been much stronger than what we saw. I think that you probably wouldn't have seen the dominance or sheer dominance of Jimmy Johnson in the later 2000s. Because it seemed like there was no true dominant team to kind of challenge the 48 car. There were some comers and goers early on, and I remember off the top of my head, the 99 and the 18 of Carl Edwards and Kyle Busch, respectively. They challenged him early, but they couldn't sustain the run, especially with the added playoff series and whatnot. But if you really would have had a strong alliance before these alliances really took off later in Jimmy Johnson's tenure, you could have seen a much different layout and different championship structure and awarding to how the 2000s could have been. I certainly agree with that. I think Hendrick's still really strong, but I don't think you see that sheer dominance from one of their all-time greatest drivers.
What about and Anthony, I'm going to pass it to you in a second. What about the strength of Chevrolet as the dominant force on the tracks? Do we Chevrolet, because of the strength of a unified, perhaps working together DEI and RCR, perhaps working closely with Hendrick Motorsports. Do we see Toyota walking into this sport and just kind of barreling through the way they have?
I think you see Chevy stay at the top for quite a while. I mean, if you look at their performance in the 2000s, they never really sloped off. As far as the fact that Dodge was in the sport, and the fact that Toyota entered in 2007, Toyota didn't really become much of a factor until really the 2010s, because up until that point, yes, you had Denny Hamlin and you had Kyle Busch doing the winning for you guys, but there was a lot of other Chevrolets that were winning. Now to kind of evolve on Peter's point with the fact that you probably don't see the Hendrick domination that you saw, I do agree with that. I don't think they really lose much in steam as far as being a power force in the sport, because I tend to think that Hendrick would have fed off of the power that Earnhardt probably would have fed into DEI. There's a lot of reasons why after Earnhardt's death that DEI, after a few years, started a great and rapid decline that we could probably get into. I think if Dale's survives that wreck, or if that wreck never happens, I think DEI is full throttle ahead. The potential for that team was immense. The potential for that team was great. Dale Jr. even said it. For that team, if it wasn't as good as it was, should have declined almost immediately after Earnhardt's passing. But because of how Earnhardt had that facility, the team set up, the management, the engineers, the chassis builders, the fabricators, they were able to sustain another solid 3 to 4 seasons of success until you started seeing some hiccups in the 2005 season. I think Earnhardt really catapults DEI, maybe even surpasses RCR. And I think that'll feed more into motivation for Hendrick to stay up at the top of their game. So I don't think you'll see the wins from Hendrick that you saw out of Jimmy Johnson, Jeff Gordon. But I do think that you're going to see continued and sustained Chevy dominance in the sport, even through to today. A guy like Dale Earnhardt, who was bow tie until the day he died, literally and figuratively, would not have allowed Toyota, Ford, or Dodge to challenge Chevrolet. And I'm not saying that he would make sure that Chevy had an upper hand or an advantage, but he would make sure that he worked those Chevys inside and out on the engines, the chassis, the fabrication, and made sure that they were the fastest thing on planet Earth. You saw that he emphasized that with the DEI restrictor plate package, and that is why they dominated between 2001 to around 2004. Dale Jr. and Michael Waltrip won more than half of the restrictor plate races during that time. And I think you'll see a continued growth, and I think DEI would still be around today in some sort of capacity, if not at close to or better than an SHR or Hendrick Motorsports capacity.
Well, I think those are absolutely excellent points. One of the things I was thinking about too, as we were talking about it, if DEI and RCR truly established that dominant alliance early on in the 2000s, who does Hendrick go to? And that's one of the things I was thinking about with Chevrolet's performance, and how does, or it is if does Hendrick and Chevy stay on top? Ganassi was Dodge, and Dodge has started dumping a ton of money into the sport. Do we still see that exist if DEI and RCR remains a powerhouse? Does Ganassi just remain with Dodge, or do they eventually get acquired with Chevrolet? And if they join Chevrolet, does Hendrick try to swoop them up and establish that first alliance to kind of counteract the powerhouse that RCR and DEI could have been? That's something that kind of crossed my mind as we were talking on those points before. Again, with Chevrolet, I think it was almost inevitable, just with the way NASCAR was going, as it was trying to become a bigger sport, a more national sport, and eventually even more of a global sport, that Toyota was going to enter. I don't think that they just kind of kicked the tires in 2006 and then just appeared and dumped a ton of money in. I think that they had a pulse on the sport for quite some time. They knew that they needed to increase truck sales, and they saw with the emergence of the Stadium Super Trucks and the Craftsman Truck Series, eventually what was later named, that they could implement their trucks in that series, start selling a ton of more trucks in North America, and eventually possibly get into the most watched automotive spectator sport in the United States. I think they may have been restricted a bit if Dale Sr. was still involved and had some influence in the sport, because I almost kind of associate it with a salary cap with certain teams in different sports, where Toyota came in and just poured an insane amount of money into developing the cars and getting their farm system right, and essentially really kind of building the powerhouse that they have today. Where it seemed at a point, and it still seems like that to this day, where they're outspending the other manufacturers. I don't think Dale Sr. would have liked that, especially driving for General Motors Chevrolet. I think he would have liked more of a fair playing field where everyone's getting a piece of the action. You can see that with his monopoly with the merchandising. In addition to that, I really think that if we would have seen a slide, and this is something I try to relate to, and again, maybe Rick can help me out with this, because this is part of an era that I didn't get to watch. But I think back to the late 80s, before the Lumina was introduced. Ford had developed the Thunderbird past a point where the Monte Carlo became obsolete, and the Monte Carlo had to develop the Aero Coupe to kind of counteract some of the advantages the T-Bird now had. And I remember reading a couple of things or listening to Darrell Waltrip and some of the legends of the sport talking about Dale Sr. was very influential with getting the talking heads and the major figures of the sport together, saying this cannot exist anymore. They are beating the pants off of us. Do something about it. And I think if we would have seen this slide from either Ford or Chevrolet that we've seen in recent years, compared to the outspending of Toyota, or even if Dodge did it in the early 2000s, I think that Dale Sr. would have been very influential in saying, listen, this has got to kind of, come back to earth. We got to make sure that everyone's got a fair shot, and the best driver's got to have a best chance to win, because that's what's getting people excited. That's what people want to see. They don't want to see somebody with the fastest car just go out there and dominate.
That segues into a great additional topic we're going to tackle this evening. But before we pursue some of the more sanctioning body type issues that Senior would have had influence over, potentially had influence over, drivers, the dynamic of where drivers were, how their careers unfolded. As a result of Dale passing, there is a domino effect that had happened. We talked a little bit earlier about Kevin Harvick, and Kevin Harvick was really not the only driver who would have been affected if indeed Dale had survived. What becomes of people, and I'll pose this to both of you, what becomes of people like Harvick, Martin Truex Jr., Clint Boyer, maybe even Tony Stewart? And then, of course, we can't really have this conversation without saying or posing the question as to what happens with Dale Jr. And so, it's interesting when you look at the influence that one person has on the entire dynamic of the sport. His survival could have changed everything just as much as his demise has. And so tell us a little bit about what your thoughts would be about what happens to the likes of Kevin Harvick, Mark Truex Jr., Clint Boyer, maybe Tony Stewart, and obviously Dale Earnhardt Jr.
I'd like to try to take this one first. I'm going with Harvick. I think if we would have seen a prolonged success and a very close relationship, as we've been talking before, with DEI and RCR, with Dale Sr. still in the picture, we may not see Harvick leave RCR in his career. I think back to, and I think Anthony alluded to it before, with I think 12 years or so that he had raced there. Harvick was still an extremely successful driver, and they were not the dominant team in NASCAR. We know that. He was able to do a lot with a little, and he was a driving force in the sport. I think we probably see Kevin stay at RCR and have a very close relationship with the driver that mentored him. I'm looking at Martin Truex Jr. He's one driver that I have to say on that short list of people who would be affected by that one man, as Rick talked about. I think he's the driver that gains the most out of this, and I think that's because he actually gets the stability that we have not seen in his Cup tenure. I don't think he bounces around teams. He has proven time and time again, once he was given the equipment and the chemistry and the culture of a top team, he is one of the greatest drivers out there. He has a immense amount of talent. He's got a clean head on his shoulders, and he really knows how to get the job done. I think if he was able to sustain that time at DEI with better leadership and a stronger performance, I don't think we see Martin Truex bounce around to all these different teams that we did. So I feel like he's probably the one that gains the most, and he probably has a lot of consistency. Who knows? Maybe we see that Martin Truex Jr. championship a little bit earlier than we did. Smoke is one that interests me a lot, and I know he's a driver that you guys follow very closely as well. Tony with Joe Gibbs Racing, if Dale Sr. survives, is something that this kind of invigorates me. This is an interesting scenario. Does he leave Gibbs still? Signs would point to yes, in my opinion, if Gibbs still goes to Toyota and gets that manufacturer backing and becomes the top dog with TRD. I think Tony still leaves. With Dale Sr. in the picture, I wonder if he would have joined Dale Earnhardt Inc. as opposed to creating his own team at Stewart-Haas. That's the one that maybe you guys can kind of pull on that a little bit further. I'll save Junior for a little later. I'll let Anthony really kind of run with that one, and I'll come in to complement that a little bit, because I have some bold predictions that I do not think he's in the 88 at Hendrick Motorsports. But really, Martin Truex Jr. is the guy that I think probably gains the most out of those four. So I'm going to ask
Peter. I'm going to ask you about Clint Boyer, and
Sure.
you know, Boyer, obviously started his career at RCR. Boyer, I'm a big believer in fitting the mold. It's interesting, and there was a famous politician. He was a guy named Tip O'Neill. He was a congressman from Massachusetts, and one of his famous phrases was, "All politics are local." And what he really meant by that was, if you look at any situation, you can kind of break it down and find commonality in almost anything. How does that relate? Clint Boyer is a Kansas farm boy. Not a whole lot different than North Carolina farm. I wonder kind of guy that Dale Earnhardt Sr. sort of starts to take under his wing, starts to embrace. Is his place at RCR more solid than it turned out to be? And does he stay in the Chevrolet camp for his entire career as opposed to moving around?
Oh, I think that is an excellent point. He's somebody that I had pinned in my notes that I completely just kind of overlooked. I mean, talk about a dream scenario for your core NASCAR fan. If Dale Earnhardt Incorporated consisted of Dale Earnhardt Jr., Martin Truex Jr., Clint Boyer, and possibly Tony Stewart. Talk about your blue-collar, roll them up the sleeves, hard-nosed, old-school drivers, all in the same squad. Now, that kind of That kind of sounds like a dream scenario to me. I think that would be one heck of a team. Talk about merchandising and the appeal to the core fan base of NASCAR. I really think that would have been something else. But to kind of finish that point with Clint Boyer, very similar to Martin Truex Jr., I think he does sustain that stability and consistency that we would have seen. I don't think him and Martin jumped to Michael Waltrip Racing. Um, Again, Michael was with Dale Earnhardt Inc. So if Michael does venture out, potentially it still could have been maybe a third satellite or third alliance team. Or even if Michael decided to go to Dodge and Toyota like he ended up doing, possibly you lose those guys. But I think if the performance was there, I don't think you see Clint leave Chevrolet either. I really think that they would have had something really special there. And going back to the type of drivers and the type of personalities those guys specifically are, I really think that would have been, I can't even call it a home run. I'd say it was out of the park grand slam on that.
Anthony?
It's an interesting perspective on Clint. He kind of gets lost in the mix a little bit as far as his RCR years. I'll start off with Kevin Harvick. Again, just going based off of the fact that it seemed like Dale had really, truly believed in him. I think that you see a little bit longer of a career with him at RCR. The one thing people often overlook is that at the end of the 2009 season, after missing the Sprint Cup playoffs, it was rumored that because of how bad of a season it was, that he was going to leave at the end of 2010 after his contract was up at RCR. The only thing that seemed to have saved his career there was some pretty quick success in winning at Talladega and then in the Coke 0400 at Daytona. And then shortly after that is when he signed the extension that eventually fulfilled the rest of his time at that team. I think if you still have Dale around and he's still a whisper in RCR's ear and in Kevin's ear, you probably see him still there today. Clint Boyer was somebody who was on Childress's radar at the time, shortly after Earnhardt's passing. I think you see Clint stay in Chevrolet just because you'll have that longevity of Harvick kind of keeping the funding there for a second team, and there was no shortage. I think Clint's worst season was his rookie season, but back then it wasn't unusual, with the exception of your last name being Johnson or Newman, for a rookie to have a mid 20th place finish in the point series. My interesting take would actually probably revolve around Michael Waltrip. I think that his career at DEI was artificially elongated because of the type of personality he is and the fact that he kept Napa on the back of that fire suit. It was an easy excuse to keep him around for the funding of that team, and I'm sure that he helped fund that 8 car and at times the 1 car as well. If Dale's around, I'm not quite sure that Michael Waltrip lasts as long as he did in the 15, but I do feel that Martin Truex Jr. would benefit from that and would probably be around a lot longer with DEI. Truex came into DEI at a time when they were in a decline. They didn't have the top equipment. His first race was the 2005 Daytona 500 with them, and I think his rookie year was 2006. Junior had a strong rookie or a strong 2006, but it was flashes, and then his other finishes were just forgettable. So if you have Senior around keeping DEI at the top, I think you see Truex and Junior staying with DEI to this day, if that's how long Junior stays in the sport. But I do think that you see Junior run that 8 car, possibly and most definitely have at least one championship to his name before it was all said and done for his career. And I do agree with Peter on Truex. I think you see a championship come a lot earlier to Martin than it did having to bounce around between teams.
I totally agree on Martin Truex Jr. I think that he has proven to be one of the elite drivers in NASCAR, and I can only imagine what his career would have been like if he were uh, a part of a very strong DEI stable. The dream team that we talked about of potentially Dale Earnhardt Jr., Martin Truex Jr., Clint Boyer, and Tony is just fascinating. And on Stewart, I don't think hunger to be an owner is quite as overcoming if he had an opportunity to go to a really strong Chevrolet team. I believe that Tony was completely averse to, joining a Toyota team. The handwriting was kind of on the wall at JGR, but it is deliciously enticing, as they say, to think about what DEI could look like with those four drivers. And picking up on what both you and Peter said, the marketing aspect of four good old boys being led by the ultimate good old boy is just staggering.
Yeah, that's something I did forget to mention is I do think Stewart goes to a team like DEI if DEI is still around in the capacity it was in 2002, 2003. I don't think he creates his own team. It's too easy to just go over to a to a 2 or 3 car team already that's well established. I think he was forced into that. There wasn't really a team out there that was Chevrolet driven that was looking for a driver at the time. Possibly you can make the argument for RCR that they could have afforded to either let somebody like Jeff Burton go and fill that seat or add a new seat. But I don't think RCR was enticing or appetizing enough for Smoke to make that move. I think he saw more benefit in it for him at that point to create his own team.
And yet, if Dale Sr. had lived, the opportunity to go over to a powerhouse that DEI would have become would have obviously been enticing for Tony to do. And I personally think if that had happened, I think he'd still be behind the wheel. I don't think he would have been as willing to walk away from the sport to just do his sprint car driving and dirt track driving and owning a dirt track and whatnot. I think he probably would have emerged as being very much the elder statesman of the sport. I always saw him, and I'm a little bit biased in this sense. I always saw Smoke as the heir apparent to Senior for a lot of different reasons. He is one of the few drivers who had the ear of the sanctioning body. He had a very, while as an active driver and even today, has a very close relationship with Mike Helton. And those are things that, that's a once a generation driver. Most of the drivers kind of know the marching orders come down from on high and they get told what to do and they just do it. There's very few people like Dale Sr. who could walk into, Bill France Jr.'s office and say, we're going to need to talk here. Tony Stewart was the same kind of guy. And I think had he gone to a very strong DEI organization, you probably would have seen Smoke being the true heir apparent to Senior.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if it extends his career. Smoke's passion has been and always will be dirt racing. So I think that decision was more made up ultimately of he knew he still had a few good years left in him for dirt, and he wanted to focus on that rather than distract himself. He already had a team to try to run. So I don't know if it extends the longevity other than, there's that one decision, there's that one factor. If he doesn't have a team to be in charge of, maybe he can balance that driving career with being on the asphalt and on dirt.
We touched on how Senior had lived, how it would have affected Dale Jr.'s career. Any thoughts on, we talked about he'd probably, Peter had some thoughts on whether he ever actually goes to Hendrick Motorsports. And if he doesn't, are we talking about Dale Jr. being among the elite that have won a Cup championship?
I think that's an excellent point. Thinking back to my points before with standing pat with, I don't think he actually goes to Hendrick. I know he was enticed by it when he filled in for Kyle Busch that one time, and he saw the difference in the equipment where DEI was, where he was at that point, to what Hendrick Motorsports had in the mid 2000s. If he stays and the performance is good, and he has the resources, the backing, and the mentorship that I think Dale Jr. really needed, I think there was a great chance. I believe, and Anthony would know this better than I would, I believe it was 2004 that he had a very good chance at winning a Cup championship. And I think if that performance was able to sustain for a little bit longer, and we don't see the emergence of a true playoff system, I think there's a very good possibility that Dale Earnhardt Jr. does win a championship driving for his father's brand.
That's absolutely right. His best chance at a championship was in 2004 while he was battling Kurt Busch. I still believe, if not for a snafu at a halftime Super Bowl celebration and the crackdown by the FCC on somewhat bad language, he doesn't get that penalty at the end of that Talladega win. And it doesn't really, in effect, kind of kill his momentum for the rest of that championship run. There was only a few races left, and even then, if memory serves me, I think he still even won that 2004 Phoenix race leading into Homestead, which would have brought him super close to Kurt Busch going into that championship battle for the last race. He still finished, I believe, third that year. But yeah, I think that he doesn't go to Hendrick. There's no reason for him to go to Hendrick if Senior's still around and if DEI is still the team that it was leading up to 2004. The other thing to realize is that there was a lot of internal turmoil in that team starting towards the end of 2004 between Earnhardt and the Urys and Earnhardt and his stepmother that, according to Kelly, started a lot of irreconcilable differences and battles between them that would have probably never existed if Senior was around. So I think that you would have had nothing but a powerhouse team. Junior would have, I think, had many more shots at championships. You wouldn't have seen the dull years from 2005 to about 2010. Again, with the exception of 06, where I think he did pull off 3 victories. It would have been a totally different game for Junior, and he's even said that he would have been a DEI driver for life. He knew that his dad made that team for him to drive in among other drivers. Kelly was even actually supposed to be a driver for that team. Kelly decided that she liked working behind the scenes more. There was a lot of different scenarios that were supposed to happen further on down that line. There was a lot. The one thing a lot of people don't know that have been given in interviews with Kelly and Junior was that there were a lot of key personnel whose contracts expired through the 2003 and 2004 seasons. And there was one glaring, I want to say, blemish in that company that caused a lot of those employees to not want to renew their contracts. And it just started a revolving door within that company. And that's why you never saw the consistency from that organization ever again.
Let's talk a little bit about the safety issues that obviously Dale's passing brought about. The mandatory use of the Hans device. It brought about accelerating the inclusion of safer barriers at tracks. Had Dale lived, would have these accelerated safety measures have been instituted as quickly by NASCAR, or would we still be looking at, walls that are solid, optional types of use of equipment like, full face shields and Hans devices, etc.? Or do you think that an older and wiser Dale Earnhardt would have been the person to speak up and say, no, we need to make things safer for our drivers because that's the lifeblood of our sport?
I don't know. I think it's tough. I don't think you see as fast of a progression for sure. We've seen in a lot of sports, even in football with concussion protocol that they have now, same thing with hockey with hits to the head. You don't really see drastic, quick adjustments and changes until something drastic occurs. For us, it was February 18th, 2001 that put a lot of things in motion. If you go back and listen to and read a lot of interviews about drivers' feelings about specifically one thing that really could have saved Earnhardt's life, which would have been a head and neck restraint system, whether it be a Hans device or something that Simpson had put out that was the Hans alternative. The older drivers like Dale Jarrett, Rusty Wallace, even Jeff Burton, Jeremy Mayfield in interviews said that they absolutely hated it because it's not what they grew up with. But there were the younger drivers that just naturally had it. Tony Stewart used it mostly from his IndyCar days, that he kind of just naturally progressed with it. I think Jeff Gordon, Peter, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Jeff Gordon used it already at that point. So I don't think you would have seen the progression towards safety until something tragic would have happened. If Earnhardt didn't pass, it was going to take somebody else to be seriously injured. I think that Dale probably wouldn't have been the motivator for a lot of that. If you just look at the way that he not his style of racing, but the way that he raced in the car. If you ever see how he sat compared to other drivers, no restraint system. He's leaning up against the B pillar. His headrest is literally bolted to the roll cage. There's a gap between the roll cage and his seat, and there's a roll bar literally sitting on his neck in the car. He was notorious for racing with loose seat belts. So I don't think he would have been the biggest proponent for safety. He probably would have been the biggest supporter for driver comfort and whatever makes you feel fastest inside the race car. He was notorious for sitting low and to the left. That's the way that he thought he was more efficient. He tried restraint systems in testing sessions, and he didn't like them. He didn't want to use them. He thought that they just didn't belong in his race car, at least. But he was never one to say, if you are going to use it, that makes you any less of a driver or any less of a man. He wouldn't have done that. He didn't do that. Because it was from a competition standpoint, you have to be comfortable in your race car to go 100%. The safer barriers, I don't think we see come to fruition unless there's an unfortunate fatal accident or severe injury that occurs at all. Those didn't even start getting talked about until at least a season or so after Earnhardt's passing. So I don't think we see the quick natural progression. Do I think we see Hans device is mandated by now, I think absolutely. I think we do see something similar to, if not already, the same type of safer barriers today. But I don't think we see them as early as 2003, 2004, and as mandated as far as Hans and neck restraint systems immediately after Earnhardt's passing. Unfortunately, those are kind of the things that it seems like it takes something tragic to happen before you realize there's really even a problem. Even the car of tomorrow, I don't even know if you see that exist in the fashion that it did in 2008 to 2010, as far as it being just super bulky and super safe and super glued to the ground. Well, so they thought before they realized if that car turns around, it's a parachute in the wind. I don't think you see the car of tomorrow at all. I think you'll see the safer barriers by that point because you will see. You can't forget Jeremy Nadeau had that really hard crash in 2002 at Richmond. Blaze Alexander, I think, passed away at Charlotte Motor Speedway in a crash in the tri-oval by hitting a part of the track that didn't have a safer barrier. So I think you see those things implemented, but I do think one of the things you probably never see is the car of tomorrow. And whether it's because there's no need for it at that point or because it's somebody like Dale Earnhardt saying, no, those cars are ugly. It's a bad marketing selling point. You need to make these cars look the way they do now, which I mean, by now, I mean in 2006 when they were pretty close to stock looking cars as far as the body shapes. I think those are the biggest differences. I think you see all the safety of features come 10 years later, and you never see the car of tomorrow.
I'd certainly have to agree with that. As I was listening to those strong points, that's exactly where I went with it. I was going to open with that mic drop and essentially say we don't get the car of tomorrow. We don't get Generation 6. We get a Generation 5 car that's a culmination of both of those essential designs, but we probably don't see it as radical for a safety standpoint as a car tomorrow was. I think it's a much more fluid transition from the Gen 4, previous, run-of-the-mill Holman Moody low-slung stock cars that we were used to. We see that kind of change over into something that is a little bit bulkier, probably a little bit more, neutral as far as how the drivers are sitting, and definitely safer. But I think, like Anthony said, it comes at a later stage because there's no aha moment or ultimate shock to the sport without losing Dale Earnhardt. I think that no moment really kind of sets more of those dominoes off towards innovating and making the sport much safer than that moment. I don't think they would have had that rude awakening that NASCAR did have. With going back to the safety aspects of it, Anthony hit on a really great point with Dale not getting on anybody about using different safety components or how they sat in the race car. I think that's a very admirable quality. He wanted to beat someone at their 100%. He didn't want to beat somebody if they were racing at 75 or anything less than that, if they weren't giving their best. So to know that he didn't get on anybody that wasn't wearing an open face helmet or didn't sit like they were almost sticking their head out of the race car is something true to be said. I don't think he would have pushed towards safety. I agree with Anthony at that point. I think he would have been, I want to be comfortable. I want to race to the best of my ability, and that's what I'm going to do. But if anybody wants to, wear one of those full face or closed face helmets, if they want to try this Hans device, if they feel that that makes them in a much better position, in a safer position in the race car, that they can give their best any given Sunday or Saturday night under the lights, then that's what he wanted as well. I think back to Jeff Gordon and some of the drivers that Anthony mentioned. One of the things as a young fan I recognized immediately was the differing helmets that some of the drivers had. It seemed like the old school drivers, the older drivers, had that open face with the bubble goggles. And I thought that was a really cool look. But, Jeff Gordon was one of those drivers. I remember he probably was not the first. I'm sure there was people before him that was wearing the closed face helmet. It was very similar to the IndyCar drivers and Formula One drivers. And I remember hearing about them talking about the safety advantages of that, because in the event of a crash, you have that frontal protection. And I think that was a great, that was a great innovation for the sport. The Hans device, I know Anthony mentioned before, if I could clarify, if Gordon was one of those first NASCAR drivers to start wearing it. I know Tony Stewart was because he was very used to it with open wheel. I can't say confidently that Jeff was one of the first, but I do know he did transition over to it very, very rapidly, especially after the loss of Dale Earnhardt Sr. So just knowing that stuff with the safety aspects of what the driver carries and how the driver sits in the car, I can't say he would have been a proponent for safety. I'm in agreement with Anthony, but I do think that you see drivers kind of picking and choosing what they want in the cars, and that still exists. I don't think NASCAR starts mandating like they did after his death that you have to have this, you have to sit this way, and this is how we're going to protect you in the car. As far as the safer barriers are concerned, I think because of IndyCar, I think we still see the safer barriers probably roll out about the same time that we did. I think that as long as IndyCar was racing high speeds on ovals, they were probably more susceptible to having a tragic loss than we were. I think they probably bring upon the engineers and the tracks and the sanctioning bodies looking at, is there a way that we can absorb any of this damage when a car comes at the wall at over 200 miles an hour on an oval? And I think that you probably see a very similar trend for the safer barriers being developed as we did. But again, the big thing is that car of tomorrow, that dreaded car that many people disliked because it was very, very common. It was very safe, very bulky looking, didn't really resemble a stock car. Although I have to say, I believe it was maybe 2011 or 2012-ish when they went away from the wing and they added the spoiler and the splitter on the front. I think that was a better look for the car. Looked a little bit more stock car, but I don't think you see that car developed. I think you kind of get a mixture between those safety features. Maybe they're not as extreme as I said before. And then you see essentially what we have now in Gen 6, where the cars kind of resemble more of your street counterparts to an extent. And, they have a little bit of that stock car kind of quality.
What about the rules packages, the changing of, the racing rules from seemingly week to week, the changes in the way the seasons are set up, the introduction of the chase, the introduction of a playoff format? What do you think Senior would say about those kinds of things? I mean, he was a vocal guy, as I said earlier. He had a direct pathway to sit with Bill France Jr. to talk about the sport, to talk about the direction of the sport. What might he say about some of the things that has fired up the fan base over the past decade or so? What do you think he would say about those things?
I think you'd see the shuffling of the schedules. Look, the fact of the matter is, whether he lives or dies, you still see the recession hit this country, and it's no doubt and not a question at all that the recession did impact our sport to a great extent, and that we're still recovering, I think, from that. I don't know that he's a big proponent for some of the technology and some of the aero packages that we have. But then again, this is old school Dale. I liken it to somebody like Darrell Waltrip still, where, change is good for the sport, but you can only teach an old dog new tricks for so long before they kind of just start resisting change. I think you don't see the aero packages that you see now, but then again, you got to really dig deep a little bit, and you got to realize that a lot of these racing issues, I think, come from the fact that we had the car of tomorrow, and we evolved from that, and then we had the introduction of the splitter to a stock car. We had the introduction to mandated springs and mandated rear wings from that car, from that package. If we don't see the car of tomorrow, I don't think we see half of the issues that we do with the packages that we have today. I think Dale will be, or would be, a big voice for change to improve competition. But I don't think we go down to the point where we're looking at splitters and increasing oil pan covers to improve the racing. There's that famous picture of Earnhardt in the tech inspection, and he's helping the car pass by lifting the car up with his foot. I don't think he would have wanted to see the cars glued down to the ground like they were Indy cars. One more thing to touch on those safer barriers, like how Peter alluded to, like with IndyCar, You don't see safer barriers around the inside of the 1.5 tracks until Denny Hamlin taps it and fractures a vertebrae in his neck. You don't see infields get paved like Pocono's Long Pond Straight unless Elliott Sadler hits that inside barricade and rips the front motor out of his car, and you see that scary image of him gasping for air as he climbs out of that car. Same thing with Steve Park and Dale Jr. when Dale Jr. pile drove him into that catch fence. That catch gate that you see on the highways was changed the following year to that gate being compounded with dirt, and then 10 years later you see Elliott's crash, and then you see the evolution of the safer barriers. There's a natural progression to these things. Unfortunately, the natural progression happens through tragedy most of these times. But a lot of the package that you see today happens because of the car of tomorrow, I feel. If you don't have the car of tomorrow, you might have something similar to what we saw in like 2011, 2012, or even the start of Gen 6. I think Gen 6 is a good return to before Car of Tomorrow, with the exception of the fact that there is still the splitter and the ride height and the shock packages. But that's just personal taste. Some people still love that kind of racing. They love that, I guess, restriction and how it makes it a little bit more fair. I loved the old school style of it. I think Dale would try to keep it as close to that as possible, and I don't think that you would see bad racing from it. Little change in the racing is probably something that probably would have been better for NASCAR over the last 15 years, instead of this current changing tide of how the competition is playing out. But I don't quite know that Earnhardt right now would be a fan of the type of aero packages that we have. That's for sure. I don't think he would be a big supporter for it at all. It puts too much reliance on the car and not really on the driver.
What about the structure of the sport itself, the playoff formats, the chase format, this desire to have a Game 7 moment at Homestead? What would he say about that sort of thing? I mean, this is a guy who spent his career where you might have had the Cup championship wrapped up sometime in late September.
Well, you got to remember, going back to the beginning of the broadcast, what the timeline of his retirement was. He was, in essence, scheduled to retire at the end of the 2003 season. The playoffs start in 2004. He really doesn't have much of a say at that point. If he was a little bit younger and he had a little bit more years in him, where he could safely, in the year 2000, make the decision, I'm good until 2008, I think he can definitely be a driving voice to say, we don't need playoffs. We don't need a 10-race playoff shootout resetting points. That basically makes the first half of the season meaningless. You never see a guy from outside the top 10 win the championship with 10 to go anyway. But I think that only happens if he had any sort of plan to be in a race car seat past 2006 or 2007. The fact that he had already established that he's going to retire in 03, I think NASCAR still goes through with the playoffs. I don't know if they go to a Game 7 moment or these like elimination stages, because you are going to have him in your ear saying, look, the playoffs are working. Don't mess with it. Like, there was really nothing wrong. They didn't need to go to these elimination stages. It does add some excitement, but I hate the mandatory Game 7 moment. I don't like it because you're forcing it, and it just doesn't feel as genuine. We had races in the chase where 2010, Jimmy Johnson, Denny Hamlin battling it out to the last race after a 10-race shootout. 2012, Tony Stewart, Carl Edwards tied after 10 races. The tiebreaker goes to the winner of Homestead. They battled it out 1-2 for the last 20 laps, and it was one of the best Homestead races you saw, other than, I think, honestly, last year's Homestead race. I don't see the playoffs happening. I see the playoffs happening, but I don't see the playoffs being what they are today if Dale Earnhardt is still alive. And it's simply because of the timing of his of what he when he plans to retire. At that point, he can be a voice, but I don't know if NASCAR generally listens, because it seems like that was something that Sprint wanted and not NASCAR. Not to say that NASCAR was against it, but it was Sprint that brought it to the table and really wanted it. And NASCAR said, you know what? This might be cool. Maybe Earnhardt can change it, but I doubt it. I do think he prevents this elimination stages and the Game 7 moments from happening.
I'd like to go back to what we talked about earlier. I think of Rick's points where he was the businessman, and it kind of goes into my interpretation or understanding of who Dale Earnhardt Sr. was to me as a Gordon fan, as somebody who wasn't the Dale Sr. Intimidator fan. And I think back to that word I used before, the respect. I respected the heck out of him, but I didn't root for him. I see two sides to this here. I see Dale Sr. as the driver, like Anthony alluded to. He's probably not the biggest fan of this major shakeup. Again, he appealed to the core fan. He appealed to people that were like him, as Rick said as well. I don't think that this kind of major change fits that bill. He probably would have seen the direction of the sport, and maybe that does allude to the 2003 before 2004 playoff creation. I mean, that might go hand in hand. I think that was a great insight by Anthony there. I think that he would have said, well, that's different. I don't know if that's, what we are. And we've talked about that in our previous casts where we're talking about the core fan versus NASCAR pursuing the new casual fan or the new market of fans. I think that Dale Sr. had his niche, had a great understanding, because we saw with the development of the business and the merchandising and the marketing aspect that he really had a good pulse and grasp on the nature of the sport, that he probably wasn't going to be the biggest supporter of that kind of system, regardless of it being a Game 7 elimination format or the first couple of iterations that we saw of the chase. The other side of the coin is Dale Sr., the businessman. Knowing what he was able to succeed with Action Performance and the merchandising and all of that stuff, he probably would have seen the playoffs or the chase, the original format, as an opportunity to cash in even further. You're taking the best drivers of the season. You're creating new merchandise for them. You're marketing them in a different way that highlights the importance and the speciality of them doing really well all throughout the first part of the season. And he could probably see that as a new gold mine. Wanting to be a part of that, wanting to make sure that his teams will always have a spot in that playoff format to market it even further. I think that you see that aspect of it. So if and Anthony alluded to it before, if he does bow out and retire, had he survived, bow out and retire before the playoffs are implemented, he probably would have been an influencer on either side and seeing the positives of the merchandising and marketing aspect as NASCAR tries to appeal to a much larger audience throughout the country. He probably could have seen the business aspects maybe entice him a little bit further. So I'm kind of in a toss up there. That's where I feel with it. I think that as the driver, and it probably resonates with many of the drivers today, especially, if I was in their shoes and I knew that I could win essentially 35 out of 36 races and possibly still lose the championship, I'd be very nervous. So there's that aspect of what we have going on in our current format. Now, I know that example is a very extreme and highly unlikely scenario, but
Peter, you saw that last year, though.
Yeah.
You had Kyle, Kevin, and Martin who won easily half of the races, I think, last year. And they got beat by a guy that won 2 races for the championship.
Yeah, and that's a topic for another time that we could probably debate for another hour and a half or so, or however long we're going with this one. But you really look at it and you say, like, is that the greatest way to crown a champion? And that brings up a whole other topic, as I said before. But to see where he would have I guess aligned himself would have been really something else, in my opinion. I would have liked to have seen. Again, that goes to are we getting Dale the driver or Dale the businessman as far as his support for the playoffs go?
And that's the perfect point, Peter, is that as Dale got older, I think he started to understand more and more the business of the business, and I think he would have been somewhat conflicted on that. I think Dale the driver probably would have felt totally differently than Dale the businessman. Which kind of leads us to the last couple of topics to tackle, and that is, Dale was always very proud of his Southeastern roots. One of the reasons you can go to any track anywhere and you see the T-shirts, the hats, the die-cast cars, everything that relates to that 3-car, you still see it to this day. And it's not just people my age, it's young people as well. And it's because he became an iconic brand. And a good part of that brand centered on where he was from, being really true to his roots, even though the reality is he was a multi-million-dollar businessman. How would a living Dale Sr., do you think, react to two things? The abandonment of some of the traditional tracks in the Southeast, tracks that he grew up with, and how would he feel about what now NASCAR, as recently as last week, has admitted that their core fan had been somewhat slighted over the past several years in favor of pursuit of a more international outlook to attract fans? How do you think Dale Sr. would feel today about those things, and what kind of influence you might think he might have had on the whole process?
I think he probably keeps the flagship schedule that we saw in the early 2000s a little truer. In 2001, NASCAR was already going to new locations like Chicagoland and Kansas for their inaugural races. So this is something that he was going to be a part of in the natural flow of it. I think you see Rockingham probably stick around on the schedule a little bit longer, if not permanently. I don't know if you see the talk of today with Nashville and Rockingham coming back onto the schedule, because I don't think there's a desire would be as much of a demand for it, because I don't think he kind of lets NASCAR get too far away from that. I think he's the one person in NASCAR that probably, look, Earnhardt was shied away from voicing his opinion, whether he liked something or didn't like it. He was going to tell you exactly like it was. He shot from the hip every single time, but it was always an educated fire. If he was still around, I think you see a tradition of Southeast NASCAR in NASCAR, and I don't think you leave that. I don't think you need to try to regather yourself, so to speak, as a way of apology to the fans for losing their way. But again, I think that's all a compounded issue of the product that they're putting on the track. If the cars raced better, you wouldn't care about what kind of tracks they went to, because the racing would be good regardless. Whether or not it's a single issue where you could fix it with just one thing, as far as switching out the tracks every once in a while, or reshaping the playoffs, or just putting a different stylized car out. I don't think you'll ever be able to tell unless you do one change at a time, which it seems like they're trying to start to do with this revamped schedule for next year and potentially Gen 7 in 2021. But I don't think you stray far from NASCAR's roots if he's still around, because he will be that constant whisper in the ear of the France family saying, "Hey guys, getting a little too far away from the broken path. We got to stay. We got to stay where we came from. Our our future is as important as our past, and we can't forget where we came from."
It's interesting you raised that about how vocal Senior was, and I want to give Peter an opportunity to talk about this. This is a story that really informed NASCAR fans will remember, and it's kind of a sad story in many ways, but it gives you some insight as to exactly who Dale Earnhardt Sr. was as a man. It's well known that the sport lost Tim Richmond, who was, as we said earlier, an immense talent that we lost way too soon. We lost him to an illness that at that time nobody really understood. Nobody really knew what it was. There were lots of suspicions as to how the HIV virus was transmitted. It raised an awful lot of negativity. That's what happened in the Magic Johnson case, and the Tim Richmond case was really no different. NASCAR at the time that this went on was a sport primarily consisting of folks from the Southeast with generally very conservative values. As a sanctioning body, NASCAR was really no different than the audience that they had. Dale Earnhardt was the guy that went to the France family and said, "We are not going to make this man who has given so much to our sport, who could mean so much more to our sport if he weren't sick. We are not going to turn him into a pariah." It takes a giant to be able to do that. There are very few people in the history of athletics that could take on an entire system. And the name that comes to mind almost immediately is somebody like Muhammad Ali. He took on the entire United States government and said, "This is an unjust war. I'm not going over there." Dale Earnhardt is in that kind of category. That's the kind of man we're talking about. And that's the kind of visionary that he was, in terms of, you had to, for as ferocious as he could be on the track, he was very humane. And I for our new viewers that are not really conversant in NASCAR's history, the one takeaway from this show would be that, as immense a talent he was a brilliant businessman, and he was an incredibly humane human being. Peter, thoughts on his southeastern roots and how the passion for those roots would have affected him had he lived, and NASCAR's movement away from and now movement back toward the traditions of NASCAR.
Well, I think it kind of falls into the same category for me, where we saw the playoffs go when we were talking about that and discussing that not too long ago, where I feel like the enticing opportunity as a businessman for the growing sections of the country would have been something that he would have probably had a very difficult time passing up, especially with the emergence in the 90s, the marketing boom, the merchandising boom, and all of those things that we've discussed in great detail before. I think that he would have been inclined to have seen and tested markets that haven't been established before. But I also do agree with Anthony's points and yours as well, where I don't think we see that abandonment. I think they really try to focus on keeping the sport in the heartland, in the roots that we see the sport hinting at possible return to. I think that they would have really, and especially with Dale Sr.'s leadership, I think they would have really seen, what do we have here? Is North Wilkesboro a place that we have to pull away from because the attendance isn't there? And then does the same thing happen to Rockingham? Does the same thing happen to other tracks that we ended up pulling away from? Or is he one that says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and let's stay where we're successful, and let the sport kind of grow on its own, and then maybe we can test some of these new areas in the future instead of kind of abandoning where we are to push these new areas? I think that's the great question that I have. Again, I think he would have been intrigued by growing the sport and developing it into new areas. I mean, he saw the emergence of Jeff Gordon, the West Coast driver. He also handpicked Kevin Harvick, another driver from the West Coast. So he did know and understand that there was opportunity and there was talent to be had in different parts of this country. But I do think that he would have really, really tried to understand and been a very vocal part of maintaining the sport where it was as you try to move it on to the next level, instead of kind of just picking up and leaving where you were to just kind of grow the sport just nationally. I think he would have said, hey, we got to hang on to what makes us us, but we also have to figure out a way to kind of branch out a little bit without losing sight of where we came from.
As a final thought before we wrap up tonight's special edition of Three Wide, do you think that, along with what you just said, Peter, that Dale would have frowned upon the very rapid fashion that you see drivers being brought along today? It's a year in truck, a year in Xfinity, and then we're talking about being a Cup driver. The world that he was from, you actually really had to pay your dues. You had to work that local short track circuit, forever before you even got a shot. How would he react to the way the mindset is now, where you just see the almost a factory of young drivers being pushed at such a young age with, and Tony Stewart was talking about this just a couple of weeks ago, that, you've got guys that haven't even been in a seat before at a high level of racing who are getting the opportunity to, to actually become a Cup driver long before we've ever seen him become Cup before. What do you think he'd say about something?
Well, I think that's an excellent point here. I love that you brought up Tony Stewart's opinions there, because I think that weighs heavily on what Dale Sr. would have felt. I ultimately think that he wouldn't have been a fan of this new system where we're churning out drivers and they're, pretty much not even graduating high school and they're in a Cup seat. That seems to be where we're trending towards. I think that was a play by NASCAR to try to appeal to a younger audience. I think that a lot of these young and up and coming drivers are immensely talented. However, I do think that with the financial backing and the very fast track system or a sponsorship driven system, I think that you kind of lose sight of what made Dale so successful, how he was able to relate to a lot of the fans, where Stewart's comments echo that immensely. I think that you have all of these young drivers, but you have a core fan base that's probably between the ages of 20 to like 55 or 65 or so. And they don't relate to a driver who's coming out of high school. I think that has a lot to do with trying to create a new NASCAR, a new market, a new fan base, a new culture. I think that Dale Sr. would have been very much against that. As you said before, he was from the old way of, you got to pay your dues, you got to work towards that, and he put Dale Jr. through that ring. And Dale Jr. had to work hard and had to bust his butt trying to figure out how to work on the cars, how to understand the cars and drive them. He didn't give him the best stuff, and Anthony would attest to that as someone who was a true diehard fan of Dale Earnhardt Jr. from start to finish. I really don't think he'd be a proponent of that. That being said, I don't think he is completely against young drivers. I think he saw the success from Jeff Gordon, who was completely against the normal cut and the normal grain of your Cup Series driver. I think that there's special cases where somebody comes along the line that is immensely talented and may not need the amount of time and care. Chase Elliott is somebody who I think is just a driven natural. He had the pedigree, the upbringing, very similar to Dale Jr. I think that Dale Sr. would have had no problem with him becoming essentially like a next Jeff Gordon, coming in his early 20s and establishing himself in the sport. But I think this fast turnover rate of, there was a point where, and I have a very good pulse on the lower series, where I knew all the truck series drivers. Now I don't. Now I feel like every year there's like maybe 5 to 10 new drivers, and teams change constantly, sponsors change constantly, and I don't know who's who. And they're all teens, and it's very different. I don't think he would have been that supportive of what it looks like now.
I tend to agree with that. I think it's part of his upbringing. It's part of who he was, part of his pedigree. His dad was hard as hell on him and didn't help him really much for any part to advance his racing career. And he helped Junior out a little bit in the beginning with his super late model stuff, but that was as far as he bought him the car, gave him the motor and said, now it's your job to maintain it and make sure you can race it every week. I think it's a big adjustment, especially you got to look at anybody that started racing in his heyday versus anybody that started in the 90s versus anybody that started in the 2000s. That was really the last generation probably of drivers and talent where they needed to prove themselves for a few years. It was as recent as 2009, 2010, where, like Rick, like you alluded to, the norm became 1 year in truck, 2 years in Xfinity or nationwide, and you were up in the cup level. And I think that hurt probably a lot of drivers' careers more than it helped by rushing them into a seat that they either weren't prepared for, or the fact that they were trying to follow that 2 year mark and kind of just fell into a seat that just wasn't very good. I think Justin Allgaier is somebody who's in the Xfinity series right now that is kind of like an older, earlier 2000s, late 90s guy that's sticking around in the Xfinity series and has basically, I think he deserves a cup shot again. Whether or not he wants to stay down in Xfinity and is content with sticking with Xfinity is definitely his prerogative. Same thing I said with Elliott Sadler. I think Elliott Sadler going back down for a few years was more than enough for him to earn himself another cup shot with a good team, with a decent team, like he had at the Yates camp before he went down to Evernham in the 19 when they were starting to decline. But look, Junior was given a lot of help, but even then he had to earn that help, and it wasn't until Yuri Sr. looked at Dale before that 1998 Busch Series season and said, "Hey, you don't have a name on the top of that car yet," and there was no plan on running that car. And Yuri Sr. is the one that said to Dale, "Why don't you put Junior in the car? You got all that money and all that equipment. You might as well invest in your own son." And Sr. said, "All right," and didn't even tell Junior. The story goes, according to Junior, that Senior didn't even tell Junior that he was driving full time in '98 for the AC Delco car. Junior walks into the shop one day, sees his name on top of the car, looks at Yuri, and says, "Man, that's a messed up joke y'all are playing on me, putting my name up on the car." He's like, "Nope, you're the driver." And he's like, "Are you serious?" And his dad comes out and says, "Oh yeah, by the way, you're the driver." Like nothing. Senior never handed anything to anyone, and he was never handed anything from anybody more than he was deserving. So if he saw a talent like Jimmy Johnson come along with not that much experience, but was able to prove himself on the track, Senior was going to be the first to say the kid earned it. Rusty Wallace hated the fact that Jeff Gordon came up into Winston Cup with such little experience in the Busch series. We saw that in the Unrivaled documentary. Earnhardt never had that problem vocally about Jeff Gordon. He raced him in the Busch series. He knew he was a good driver. He wanted that rivalry, I think. I think that helped elevate Earnhardt's game just like it helped elevate Jeff's game. I think without Earnhardt, you don't have the success that Jeff Gordon sees in the 90s and vice versa. If Earnhardt is around today, I think he's going to give guys like Kyle Busch all the credit in the world. I think Kyle Busch only did a season and a half to 2 seasons in the Busch series before he was brought up to Hendrick. Same thing with a few other drivers. Carl Edwards, I think, was in the same boat. He had like a season and a half, but he proved himself on the track. I think where the issue comes in today is like Peter's alluding to, and something that he would probably have to adapt to, is that these kids are learning how to do this on a computer now. And it transitions because of the way technology is nowadays. It transitions so well that I think Earnhardt would kind of have no choice but to just suck it up and adapt. But I think he also has the business know-it-all to be able to do that and be willing to do it.
And before I turn it over to Peter, I think the thing that probably would have frosted him more than anything else is the fact that many of these young kids don't even know how to hold a wrench, much less use it.
Yeah, it's way easier to get into Cup now than it is when he was a kid. Earnhardt had to do 5 years of moonlighting for random teams before he ever got a full-time shot.
Right. Peter, a point that you wanted to make.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. going right back into what Anthony had just said with the with paying his dues and working on, several different teams until he got his true shot. When he was mentioning Elliott Sadler and some of the other drivers that are in the trucks in Xfinity or National Series, that's got me thinking of maybe Dale Sr. would have been in the same mindset of this thought idea. I feel like when I came into the sport, when it used to be the old Busch and Craftsman Truck Series, that you had those journeymen, those late veterans that maybe drove the lesser schedule, maybe drove the lower series because they were on the latter half of their career, and I feel like that's kind of gone away. Where he was such a great role model to young and up and coming drivers in the Winston Cup Series at the time, that I feel like Dale would have been also a supporter of, we need to have veterans in these lower series to groom these young drivers, to actually mentor them instead of just fast tracking them. Okay, so they can win in the trucks, move them right up. Okay, they can win in the Xfinity, just move them right up. I think he would have really been more of a proponent and supporter of having more mentors and veterans down there. I think that's probably why you see a lot of blowback with Kyle Busch going down there and dominating the series. Although there are some pros to him being down there, where he is developing the drivers on his specific team. He's down there giving them feedback. He's down there while he's running his fast laps and showing them, this is what you need to do. This is what you have equipment wise. You should be able to replicate it. I think that Dale would have been a huge supporter of that, but he probably would have liked it from some veterans that stuck around in that sport, competed within that series of the sport. That was one thing I wanted to just kind of touch base on real quick before we wrapped it up.
Well, thanks for that, Peter. And we could go on for another 2 hours. We could have doubled the time on this show to dedicate a discussion to someone, as I said, who was just a giant. And someone who didn't just drive a car. He owned cars. He was a marketing genius. He kind of represented something in society. I alluded to, there's very few people in athletics who could stand up in a room and take a stance on something. And, like that, and I'm going to date myself now, guys, again, like that old E.F. Hutton commercial, when E.F. Hutton speaks, everybody listens. Dale was one of those guys like Ali, like back in the 20s when Babe Ruth stood up in a room and was talking about the game of baseball. And, in a lot of ways, Dale Earnhardt, in his own way, was really the Babe Ruth of our sport, because like Ruth, he made changes to the sport that we still feel today, and will feel well into many decades into tomorrow. Babe Ruth was the first guy to come along that had this ability to hit home runs. Well, now here we are 100 years later. And what is the single most exciting thing that happens in a baseball game? It's a home run, right? Everybody wants to see the big home run. Dale Earnhardt did that for NASCAR. He did that for stock car racing in general. And he continues to do it today. He's been gone, 18 years. Is it 18 years? Yes, 18 years. Hard to believe. And yet his influence is felt and seen at every track, in every race, out at the souvenir stands, even in the way we have these discussions. His influence is still felt today and will be felt. Well, you know what, Anthony? I know you're about to have a blessed event in your house. When that child has grandchildren, people will still talk about Dale Earnhardt Sr.
Absolutely. Oh, the saying goes, legends never die.
This was a lot of fun. It was an interesting look back at at one of the icons of our sport, one of the icons of sports in general. And we really hope that the viewers enjoyed this. We want to thank those who tuned in advance. We want to thank those who watch once it's posted. We do want to give a shout out to our friends at Chase Elliott Nation. I'm sure they're still busy partying, but not too long, guys. Tomorrow is Tuesday, so it's got to be back to work in the shop and get ready for Dover. Final thoughts, Peter.
Tell him.
Speaking of Dover, I just came across it before we open up the podcast for Chase Elliott Nation. He's got a new paint scheme rolling out next week, very similar to one he had last year. The colors look a little bit different. It's the Napa Brakes Chevy Camaro that he's going to be rolling out of Dover. From the pictures that I've seen, I wish I was able to kind of post them up here right now. For the pictures that I've seen, it looks like the Darlington throwback of the black and yellow car that he had back in, I believe it was 2017. So the Napa Brakes Chevrolet is going to be something really cool. So for those Chase Elliott fans, take a really good look, and you'll see a brand new paint scheme this coming week. I'm hoping the last time we were at Dover, Chase got a W, so I'm hoping to see that that happen again, go back to back, and really start to shake up these points and standings here. So looking forward to that. Can't wait to kind of digest and break down everything with Dover coming up. So looking forward to our next cast. And yeah, Anthony's got it up right there right now. I think that's a sweet looking car. It's got kind of that
I will tell you,
throwback vibe.
It is a sweet looking car, but is Anthony the best or what?
He's fast.
Just the best.
He's lightning on the keyboard. I like it.
I'm slightly above average.
Anthony, final thoughts for this evening.
I think today was a great opportunity and a great way to celebrate a great man's life and legacy, and the optimisms of the what ifs. The future of the sport is bright, no matter which way you look at it. I think we have great leadership planted in the offices of NASCAR and Charlotte that are finally fans first before employees, and will let that lead them in the right direction. Finally, I feel like we have a connection with the people up there as far as shared wants and needs for the sport. Dover's going to be one heck of a race. Chase is going to need to take advantage of those Napa breaks for sure. Chase Elliott Nation, once again on Facebook. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for letting us host our links on your pages. And I can't wait to come back and do this again next year on what would be his 69th birthday.
Anthony, tell the viewers how they can connect with us and how they can be a member of this family we have here at 3 Wide.
Absolutely. The saying goes, every time that we're broadcasting, if you come across our broadcast and you like what you hear, like what you see, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. It'll keep you posted on any of our past broadcasts, future broadcasts. Anything that we do will show up in your subscription page. And if you hit that bell icon, you're going to get instant notifications sent directly to your mobile device or to your desktop whenever you're on YouTube, letting you know when we have scheduled live events, as well as soon as we go live. For instance, today was one of those rare instances where we actually scheduled the broadcast for 8 p.m. And if you hit the bell icon, you get a notification a half hour before reminding you that we're going live at 8 p.m. So that's the best way to follow us shortly. Definitely within the next few weeks, and I promise you, before the Coke 600, we will have a Twitter account activated to give more instant and continuous updates and communications from our YouTube channel.
Well, with that, we have Dover to talk about later in the week, so be looking for notification on time and date to take a preview of Dover. Don't forget, we will have a post-race show after the race, and we've got a lot of other great things coming up here on the channel. This has been a great time It's been wonderful walking down memory lane and then kind of looking at the what if. And there was some great conversation. We hope the viewers enjoyed it. I know we did. Peter, thank you as always. A wonderful job done by you and by Anthony. Tremendous insight from a couple of really young guys who know an awful lot about the sport we love. So with that, we're going to take a look up to the tower, and we see that the spotter is telling us that we're clear. Now, until that spotter tells you that we're clear, remember,
You are all 3 wide.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Have a great day tomorrow. Good night, everybody. Thank you, guys, and we'll see everybody soon to talk about Dover.
Take care, guys.
Good night, everybody.